Thank you. My girlfriend and I used to enjoy going on weekend camping vacations rather frequently. We used to live right in the Appalachian region of Virginia, so we'd naturally seek out new locations on or near the Appalachian Mountains. We both had busy professional lives during the week, so spending time outside and away from home on weekends was quite beneficial. We'd been on dozens of camping trips in the Appalachian Mountains before this happened, but none of them had ever ended like this. It was Saturday morning, and we chose a very short 3-mile trail that goes to a wonderful isolated camping area on a flatter part of the mountain. We had never visited the precise location previously, but based on the number of evaluations the route received on Google, we figured it was a popular trail and campgrounds. We prepared our bags and loaded our camping gear into the truck before heading out. It was only a 45-minute trip from our place, but as we approached, it started raining heavily. This was very usual in the Highlands, so we were used to being outside in the rain, and it didn't upset us enough to turn back. We pulled up to the trailhead, which was actually just off the side of the road, and noticed one other car parked there. We had expected more people, given the trail's reputation, but we were relieved it wasn't busy. However, as we began to pull our stuff out, my girlfriend saw that the parked car's passenger door was cracked open a few inches. We both looked around to see if the owner was nearby, but there was no sign of them, so I went over and pushed it closed, assuming the owner had unintentionally left it open the entire time. The passenger seat was already wet from the rain, but at least it wouldn't grow worse. I returned to our car to retrieve my belongings, and we both began our journey down the route. We discussed how strange it was that the door was open, and how most people would undoubtedly notice that their car wouldn't lock because of the open door. It's also worth noting that the car was plainly newer and more expensive. That only added to the strangeness. As the rain began to fall, we began walking faster in order to reach the campsite and pitch our tent. I believe it took us approximately 2 hours to get to the end, as it was primarily uphill. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was a tent already set up in the center of the flat area. It was quite small, clearly a one-person tent. We figured they were probably inside. We pitched up our tent in a far area of the property to avoid the rain. We sat inside for an hour, eating the food we packed and laying out some of our belongings to dry, before hearing voices outside. The rain on the tent was too loud to hear what they were saying, so I opened the front and looked outside. I panicked a little since there were 2 men crouching down and staring at us from only a few feet away, but then they smiled and introduced themselves. They claimed they were staying in the tent in the middle and had been here for a few days. I quickly introduced myself and my girlfriend, explaining that we were only staying for the night. They left, and I zipped up our tent and looked at my girlfriend. The entire interaction seemed weird, and they appeared to be acting strangely. I noted that both of the men were wearing tight-fitting trousers and ordinary t-shirts, and their tent was far too small to accommodate 2 full-grown males. It really didn't appear that they were here camping or hiking, and certainly not for a few days as they had stated. We decided to leave the zipper half open, so we could keep an eye on them in case another hour passed, and nothing strange happened. Actually, we saw nothing at all. I suppose they were basically cramped up in their tent the entire time. Anyway, it was very dark outside by this point, so we decided to call it a night and prepare our sleeping bags. I zipped the tent back up and laid down close to my girlfriend. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because I don't recall anything after lying down, but I awoke a few hours later. It was still pouring when I needed to use the restroom, so I put on one of my cheap plastic rain ponchos so I wouldn't have to return to bed soaking, and then I walked out a few feet behind our tent and behind one of the trees, but I could hear voices through the rain. It was difficult to determine where they were coming from, and I moved my head in every direction as I became increasingly worried, but I saw no one. When I looked over at the small tent in the middle, I spotted the front zipper was open. It was difficult to see through the darkness and rain, but I was quite certain that no one was inside. I knew the men had told me they were spending the night in the tent, so this made me even more apprehensive. I dashed over to my tent, jolted my partner awake, and told her about the situation. She was definitely exhausted, but I could see she was equally concerned as I was. As we were debating what to do, we both heard voices behind our tent. I wasn't sure what to do, but sitting in the tent no longer felt safe. I instructed my girlfriend to pack the bags quickly and be prepared to leave if necessary. And then I grabbed a tiny pocket knife and dashed out, looking across at the woods and noticing the two men from earlier standing just a few feet away from our tent. I vividly recall both males looking at me with no emotion. They did not make any facial expressions or move at all. I knew at that point that these individuals were going to do something terrible. They weren't afraid of me at all. A second later, my girlfriend looked out of the tent, which brought me out of disbelief, and I yelled at her to leave, pointing to the way back down the mountain. I followed her, leaving my bag in the tent behind. I looked back just as we reached the edge of the campsite, and the two men were still standing there. They didn't even try to chase us. Instead, they remained there and watched as we fled in terror. I'd say we were sprinting for about 10 minutes before slowing down and walking quickly the rest of the way. When we returned to the automobile, we noticed that the other parked car was still there, but the passenger door had been opened again. I immediately drove us to the nearest petrol station, where we phoned the police and were met a few minutes later to discuss what had transpired. A few days passed, and we received a lot more information, which made everything much more terrible. When an officer went down to check, they discovered that the car belonged to an older guy who had lately been reported missing. All of the goods from the automobile had been stolen, and they were able to corroborate that the old man also owned the tent on the campground. They did not discover the two males, nor did they find any substantial proof other than their shoe prints. The old man was also missing, and as far as I know, he has never been discovered. This made both my girlfriend and myself ill, knowing that we might have been just seconds away from anything terrible. I suppose we'll never know for sure what the two men were up to, but I believe we can all make a very reasonable guess based on the circumstances. But what I do know is that the image of those two men standing in front of me continues to haunt my recollections to this day, despite the fact that I was fortunate enough to have a career that allowed me to travel extensively in my late 20s and early 30s. I would usually only spend a couple of days in one location for work, so I was limited in how much I could do when I was staying somewhere nice, but I had a week-long job in Pennsylvania that ended a day early, so I'd still have to stay there for an extra day before my flight. Because I rarely got to go out, I decided to make the most of this opportunity and do something enjoyable. I chose a long trail that led through some of the beautiful woodlands and trees here. I've always appreciated nature, but my profession required me to spend most of my time indoors or on flights. So this was a great opportunity for me to enjoy the lovely weather and sights. I awoke early, but I had to go to the store because I hadn't packed any hiking clothes. The trail was about an hour away from my accommodation, and I arrived shortly before 12 p.m. I was relieved that no one else appeared to be present. When I checked up the trail online, it showed it would take approximately 6 hours to get there and back, so it was really an all-day event. I had a little rucksack with a water bottle and some snacks, so I brought it and began making my way down within the first hour. It was incredibly pleasant. Just being alone on a trail between the trees was very calm and a good way to unwind from my hard work. But as I walked, I observed a man sitting on the ground along the way ahead. He appeared to be asleep, with his head down and a hoodie covering his face. As I approached, he stared up at me, nearly glaring me down as I passed him. I had no idea what to make of him, but it was creepy, so I kept checking behind me every few minutes as I walked down the trail. After a few hours, I became tired and hungry, so I located a tiny log. I sat down at the edge of the path to have my snack. I was sitting there for 3 or 4 minutes when the man I had walked past earlier appeared down the road and approached me. He was still quite a bit away, so I decided to quickly pack my stuff and proceed down the trail so that I wouldn't have to contact them. Apparently, my strategy did not succeed. Only a few minutes later, I heard heavy running footsteps behind me and spotted the man jogging in my direction. I stepped to the side, expecting he'd just pass by, but he came to a stop directly in front of me. I'll admit, I was worried and uneasy about this guy. He didn't say anything, but he reached into his pocket and brought out a wallet, saying, "I think you dropped this." The wallet wasn't mine, and I could tell it was absolutely empty. I told him that he was mistaken and that I had not brought my wallet with me. He replied, saying he knew it was my wallet and that I needed to return it. I honestly wasn't sure what to do or say. However, I could tell in his eyes that he was becoming angry. I was quite confident this guy was attempting to play some odd trick to rob me or something, but I didn't know what else I could do except simply listen to him. So I said okay and took the wallet from his hand. Then he looked me in the eyes, grinned, and said, "You are welcome." Then he started down the trail. I waited there for a minute, contemplating the previous interaction, before holding out the wallet for a closer look. It was a normal brown folding wallet that appeared worn and aged. I opened it and checked each pocket, but there was nothing inside. I was perplexed. I had no idea what to think, but I knew I didn't want to run into this man again, so I simply began making my way back to my car. It was 4 p.m. now, and I had a little more than 2 hours before returning to my car. I tried to enjoy the walk, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, and it was making me increasingly nervous. I kept looking around to make sure he wasn't following me, but eventually I saw my car up ahead. The sun was just setting, creating a long shadow over everything, and my car was parked facing the trail, so I was walking towards the front. When I was a few steps away, I noticed a man's shadow emerge from behind the car, as if they were squatting. I paused in my tracks, staring at their silhouette next to my car. I knew that fleeing would almost certainly end horribly, but I also knew that he was likely to try to take my car and rob me once I got inside. After a few seconds, I gently reached into my pocket for my keys before approaching the passenger door. I swiftly opened the car and entered from the passenger side. I could hear the man immediately get up and rush for the driver's side door, but I locked it from the inside just as he tried to unlock it. He began hammering on the window as I slid into the driver's seat and turned on the ignition. I recognized the man from before, and he started yelling at me to return the wallet. I ignored him and reversed out onto the main road, driving away as swiftly as possible. As I was backing away, he dashed back onto the path and into the trees. I suppose my approach succeeded, presuming it threw him off by not going to the driver's side door, giving me time to slip in and lock it. I remembered seeing a police station on the way, so I stopped and went inside to report the man and hand over the wallet before returning to the hotel. I contacted one of my friends to tell them about it that night, as it was just such a crazy circumstance. It's clear he was attempting to rob me or steal my car, but I'm still wondering what the purpose of the wallet was, as it didn't appear to have any significant relevance. Anyway, I'm just glad I made it out safely and without losing anything. I always carry a little pocket knife with me when I go for walks now because you never know what strange situation you might find yourself in. It was at the end of October last year, which always makes for ideal trekking conditions because it is neither too hot nor too cold. I had a group of friends with whom I went hiking frequently, but most of them had jobs with no set schedules, making it difficult to find days when we could arrange a hike together, so I'd often go on shorter hikes alone and simply enjoy the peace and quiet. I had the weekend off, so I discovered a beautiful hiking and camping path nearby and drove up there on Saturday morning. I had actually walked on this trail a few years earlier and had always wanted to return. It was a loop route, which meant it ran in a wide circle from the beginning and lasted about a day and a half. I parked my car in a little dirt lot and walked up to the trailhead. The first several kilometers were level and mostly passed through grassy fields before entering a forest at the base of a small mountain. It was probably midday, and I was deep into the forest when I noticed a man walking up ahead. He was too far away for me to determine if he was walking towards her or away from me, but as I moved forward, I realized he was walking towards me. This wasn't a popular trail, and the last time I climbed it, I don't recall seeing anyone, but it was the weekend, and I believed he had the same goal as me. As he approached, I realized he didn't have a backpack on, which was strange given that I was probably 6 or 7 hours down the route, and no one would go this far without even a water bottle. He waves to me when he's a few feet ahead. I return the gesture of politeness while remaining wary due to the remote location. As he walks by, I hear his footsteps halt and the soil crumble as if he turned around. When I look back, he is facing me, and he asks me a curious question. "Where is your group?" I wasn't sure how to reply, because all I could think about was whether this guy knew I typically hung out with a group or whether he was just trying to figure out that I was alone. Either way, it was unnerving and made me nervous. I replied, telling him that they were on their way a few minutes after me. I couldn't think of anything else to say, but I certainly didn't want this man to think I was alone. "Good," he replied, then smiled and resumed walking. I continued in the opposite direction along the route. A few hours passed, and I spent the majority of my time thinking about that guy and how bizarre the entire event was. The fact that he didn't have a backpack thus far into the hike made the situation even more frightening. To be safe, I opted to set up camp a little ways off the main trail. I located a beautiful flat location about a half-mile off the route and set up my tiny tent. The light was setting, so I sat outside my tent and tried not to think about the guy. I had prepared a pre-packed lunch for the journey, so I took it out and completed it before going down in the tent to try to sleep. I had been lying there for probably more than an hour, unable to sleep, when I heard footsteps coming from the trees behind my tent. I froze, listening to them approach me. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just an animal or something, but the steps were unmistakably human. They appeared to be about 15 to 20 feet distant when they abruptly came to a halt. I sat there for what seemed like hours, lying quiet and listening closely, my heart beating, but there were no further footsteps. I knew they had to be nearby, since I would have heard the footsteps fade away if they had gone. More hours passed, and the sun had barely begun to rise. I knew I had to get out of here at some point, and I was so sleepy that I wondered if I hadn't heard the footsteps go. I unzipped the tent and opened the flaps slightly to peer outside, but there was nothing there, so I walked out and looked about. It was incredibly quiet, and the trees blocked the majority of my view, but no one was visible. After a few minutes, I carefully packed up my tent, still looking around regularly because I was clearly on edge, and every slightest noise made me jump. I quickly linked my tent to my bag and began walking back towards the trail, but I only got a few steps before discovering obvious footprints in the soil just behind a tree near where I placed my tent. I started panicking and didn't check for any more footsteps as I dashed towards the trail. I was afraid now because I knew someone was stalking me in the midst of a remote forest, hours away from somewhere secure. When I got back to the path, I swiftly started walking back the way I came. At this point, it would have been quicker to continue down, but I figured whoever was observing me would be waiting for me to do so. Fortunately, nothing more happened on my trip back to my car, which I didn't reach until after dusk. I informed my friends about the weird man and what I heard and saw, and they all agreed I was lucky to get out of there without any further incidents. I phoned the police to report the strange activities on the route, but little was done about it. I'm definitely more cautious when trekking and camping now, and I rarely go without a group of people. I'll never know what that guy's genuine motives were, and I pray no one else does either. Thank you.